everybody, this is Naz, and men lie, women lie, but stats don't lie. Welcome to season 2. It's been a while since we've gotten a chance to do one of these videos, so I thought I'd do one today. I'm going to try and get back to doing these at least a couple times a month, hopefully weekly. We've got a lot to talk about today. The first major post-TI6 LAN just kicked off and ended this past weekend was MDL. It was a great tournament, extremely competitive, as you can see here in the standings. None of the teams went through the weekend without dropping at least one series. Evil Geniuses, who did win the event, was their first LAN win of 2016 and not 2015, as it says on the slide, but they did manage to come through in the end, taking out Newbie, who had previously defeated them in the winners bracket finals in a dramatic best-of-5 grand finals. This does make Crit the new captain of Evil Geniuses here in the post-roster shuffle. 6 of 16 in his past 16 LAN events over the last 12 months. It's a pretty remarkable record. He had a lot of success with OG, as you guys know, and he's now going to be leading Evil Geniuses this season. I expect a lot from him and from that squad. Milk has called them the best roster in the history of Pro Dota 2. I don't necessarily agree with that. I look at TI4 era DK as probably still up there in my rankings, but I do think this EG squad has a chance to be very, very special. One of the things that we noticed throughout the weekend at MDL, there's some very high-level individual play, some young players in particular really proving themselves. There were some glaring weaknesses in team play. I tweeted toward the end of the tournament that I thought the last couple series were very, very compelling. It was actually Lil, one of my favorite support players in the scene, that tweeted back, "You must be joking. These teams are really not playing very well." I'm paraphrasing there. I think a certain amount of that is expected so soon after roster shifts. There were some coordination issues in some of the games. EG, in fact, made some very glaring errors in their winners bracket final series against Newbie. But again, I think talent won out, and I think you are seeing that the talent pool and the pool of teams that are capable of contending for a major championship is still very, very broad, much more so than a year or two ago. The meta is still very diverse. We did see 81 heroes in 50 matches, not quite the same as the 91 heroes that we saw in 47 matches at TI6. There are those out there that believe that the patch is getting a little bit stale. We'll talk about that here coming up in a second. But I think, again, the theme of the weekend for me was young players really stepping forward and showing their potential. I thought OG's Anna looked pretty good his first time out with the team at a major LAN event. There were some consistency questions, in particular early on in the tournament. He went 2 and 17 in back-to-back games with Drow and Sniper against Newbie. Again, Newbie showed themselves to be one of the better teams, perhaps even the best team, despite the final laps against EG at the event, so it's hard to blame him there. Maybe those were drafting issues. Having to run those two heroes mid is not necessarily the easiest thing in the world when you're a new player, but still consistency is going to be a concern for them going forward. I thought he showed enough promise on OD, on Storm Spirit, etc., though, that there's a lot of reason for optimism among the OG fan base. The two players really stood out to me. SCCC really belongs in a class by himself in terms of a guy that played, I believe he played with CDEC Avengers this past season. It might have actually been Newbie Young. Now that I'm thinking about it, I might be confusing the two Chinese players here that I'm talking about, but SCCC and LGD's current Monet, I believe one was with Newbie Young, the other was with CDC Avengers. Both of them I thought looked very solid in this tournament. In fact, we're going to talk in a minute. SCCC had maybe the finest invoker game of the year, right up there with Wee's performance at TI6 and with Denny's at Starladder. These players just showed amazing, amazing skill ceilings and potential going forward. And you really have to look at this tournament and how, in particular, Newbie looked and ask yourself whether this Chinese model of player development, where a lot of the big organizations, most of them have at least one and some of even multiple youth squads or potential squads, whatever you want to call them, to bring these young players along to develop talent that's eventually going to make its way up to the main roster. In fact, we saw Vici Gaming this past season. Their so-called B team, Vici Gaming Reborn, actually came forward and took over the top roster spot over what was their top squad, anchored by Burning. I think a question that's been on my mind for a long time when you look at the Western scene is, where is the new talent going to come from? Because we've seen many examples. We've seen some people come up as young pub stars like Sumail and just absolutely crush it at the pro level. We've seen other examples, I don't want to name any names, of players that are very, very talented, very good in pubs, really struggle in making that transition to the pro level. Miracle is another, again, success story, but I don't know how much you want to count on that. Those are superstar caliber players. Eventually, you're going to need to replace your sort of league average player, for lack of a better term. And what I'm concerned about is we don't necessarily have that clear funnel for young talent to come up in the West, especially with kind of the death of leagues like NEL. And it is a little bit of a worry for me. The Western scene does need to address this eventually. And I really do think between ZYF or N's performance, as we're now calling him, playing for Vici Gaming, looking at SCCC and Monet, I think that the Chinese teams, it looks like their development model might really be paying off. The other region that I really am concerned about going forward is CIS. You're looking at a ton of talented young players in CIS right now. You think about Ramses, you think about Pasha and Nono, who really aren't going anywhere. You're not seeing them as much in terms of their names on the international stages. And that's something, to me, that's a real issue for that region going forward. The other thing I wanted to mention about MDL, this was a tremendously well-run event. All the reviews that you read from people that attended, from players in particular, were very, very positive. And this is a real, you talk about steps for the Chinese scene. Chinese Lands has had a bit of a reputation in the past, not just the Shanghai Major. It was really great to see a LAN over there run the right way. So congratulations to MarsTV and all their partners on a terrific event. So some of the things individually that stood out for me, again, we talk about player performance at the event. SCCC really stood out in terms of having the highest overall KDA, followed closely by his teammate UU9, of course, who we've talked about before as a very promising young player. Again, really the Chinese youth was really the story of this tournament. Of course, OG, No-Tail performed very well, Ana performed very well, and you're going to see those EG players up there. Secret is a team to watch going forward for me. They've taken a little bit of an experiment. They've imported some SEA talent, combined them with Puppy. If anybody can get that team playing on the same page, it is going to be Puppy, and they obviously have plenty of talent to work with. So what really stood out to me in the grand finals, EG had just outstanding defensive support play. And this is something, again, EG has changed up its supports. They've brought in Zai. They've brought in Crit to replace PPD and Fear, who were their support duo over most of the last couple of seasons. Again, won a TI together. And you really, the spotlight is going to be on that support duo, I think possibly even more than Artur returning from Team Secret to perform. And I really felt like they delivered in this tournament, and especially in the grand final. If you look at their defensive support play in this series against Newbie in their 3 wins, their team combined for healing over half of Newbie's total damage output before reduction in those 3 matches. This is a tremendous amount of sustain. It's going to let your core heroes, even if they get a little bit underfarmed, it's going to keep them in fights, going to keep them contributing, make sure that they continue their level and their item progression. And I thought the fact, too, that they're doing it with very diverse hero pools. There was only one pick that EG repeated in this series, and that was the Universe Axe. They really showed a lot in terms of their ability to run these defensive, sustain-oriented supports with a lot of different hero configurations. And that's promising to me going forward. This is something that Fly used to do a lot, used to draft a lot when Crit played for OG. I'm really hopeful that Crit can draft the same kind of lineups. Make sure you focus on those defensive supports that still have playmaking potential in team fights. So I thought that was very impressive. This was I mentioned this performance before, but this was a match that, if you're an Invoker player, as I am a fan of the hero, you should definitely go back and watch. This was game 2, the clinching game of the winners bracket finals against Evil Geniuses, where SCCC on Newbie just had this Invoker performance for the ages. You can see he does well over twice as much damage as any other hero in the game. He's over half of his team's total damage output. And if you just look at the spell usage, this is all off the Dota Buff combat tab that's available on their match replay pages. It's a really great feature. If you just look at his spell usage, and just how many times he's casting all of these different spells. Really, the only spell that he didn't use regularly in the match was Ghost Walk, which is pretty impressive to me. And if you look at what he was able to do, in particular with Deafening Blast, the spell that he used least, toward the end of the match, he actually got 3k enemy hero damage on only 6 casts of the spell. Not only is he using all of Invoker's spells regularly, comboing them up, but he's getting a lot of damage output, a lot of effect every time he's using them in team fights. He actually had 3 back-to-back casts of the spell that did 2k damage just by themselves. It really is tremendous to me the way he was able to realize the full potential of this hero, and I really do think it compares favorably. If you go back and look at the stats from Wii's just outstanding 23, 4, and 13 performance against Fnatic at TI6. I think in this particular game, SCCC's spell usage was even maybe half a step above Wii's in that match. So this was just a tour de force, a performance for the ages. We're going to talk a little bit about 6.88E. This is the new patch that came out directly after MDL, and it was pretty obvious that what happened in that tournament had a huge impact on the patch. The top 8 most contested, most picked banned heroes during MDL, and 17 out of the top 21 heroes at the tournament were all directly nerfed in these patch. 26 out of 30 of the changes that were made in the balance patch were to individual heroes and skills, and most of them, the overwhelming majority, were nerfs. So this was really a patch about scaling a bunch of heroes back. Now, most of them were modest, all right? Even abilities, so a Mirana Ags nerf was something that I expected for a long time. I think everybody saw this coming, but it's a relatively minor change. The Ags cooldown on Starstorm goes from 8 to 9 seconds. Again, sort of minor tweaks. You look at Shadow Poison, its initial damage was reduced at low levels, but it's really the stack damage, which wasn't touched, that makes up for the bulk of the ability's total damage output. So these were just little nudges to the meta, and I think that this is a really good approach to take given where we are right now. We've talked at TI, we talked a little bit earlier about how the meta is still very diverse. There's still a lot of heroes that are being regularly picked that are extremely viable. There are just some heroes that feel like they're a little bit too good. The one hero I'm surprised didn't maybe get a little bit more of a nerf bat is Batrider. He was 18-8 in MDL, and he's probably the hero to me that has remained, maybe alongside Wisp, but that has, by himself, Batrider has remained relevant and even dominant in an amazing number of different metas throughout the last couple of years. He's started to really come back on the scene and dominate again, and the nerf that he got was very, very minor. It was, I believe it was a 3-second increase in the cooldown for Flame Break from 14 to 17 seconds, so it's really not going to hurt him very much. In terms of the timing of this patch, I think a lot of these changes were things that we would have expected right after TI6 anyway. The one thing that maybe we wouldn't have is OD has really, really come up in a big way since TI in the meta. There were a lot of people that were talking about him before TI6, but you only saw him picked twice in 171 matches at Seattle. So this wasn't a hero that had a lot of presence there. However, he was hugely contested at MDL. He was fairly good when he was picked, so it's not so surprising that you saw this hero get adjusted. Really, the biggest changes, not surprisingly, were these global changes. The infused raindrop cooldown change is something that was very, very badly needed. Heroes like Lina and Zeus were just almost taken out of the game, especially at the mid-roll in terms of the impact of raindrops. It's very, the return once raindrops are in the game to having a mid Zeus or a mid Lina over leveled at the beginning of the game is so much less, and the cooldown change is going to make it more likely that these heroes can do a bit more spike damage with their spell combos early on in the game. They're going to be more likely to get those kills on the enemy support. So I think this is a really good change. The Diffusal Blade cooldown, again, one of the things in terms of the global meta that a lot of people have been complaining about at and in the wake of TI is the dominance of illusion-based heroes. This diffusal change is really all about illusions because, of course, it's the illusion-based heroes that are buying this item, that are using the active to get those individual kills, and, of course, the illusion building damage reduction going from 25 to 30%. That is, buildings are now going to take a little bit less damage from those illusion spamming heroes. So I think, again, these are small changes, but it's reflective of a meta that's fairly mature. There are a lot of heroes viable. You don't necessarily want to give anybody a huge buff or a nerf. You just want to nudge things that may be a little bit overpowered. There's always the discussion when you start talking about a new patch, whether or not it's oriented toward the pro game or it's oriented toward pub matches. 6.88E and indeed the last couple versions, big patches of Dota that we've seen have really been about balancing at the pro level. Even Outworld Devourer, as we were talking about a page ago, having come to prominence at MDL, OD has really, really been a thing in pubs. I have this page sorted here. This is Dota Buff's meta tab under heroes, and it breaks out the win rate and pick rate of each hero by MMR bracket. And as you can see, OD over the last month has actually been the third most picked, has actually been the third highest win percentage in the 5K plus bracket, and he's actually the highest pick rate of any of these heroes that we're showing here on the screen. So this is a hero that's gained a lot of ground in pubs. It's actually been disproportionately in high level pubs. So you can see his pick rate is much, much higher in 5K plus than it is even in 4K. The other change that I think, the change that I think is really unambiguously pub related is definitely the Omni Knight change. This is something that we've expected to see for a long, long time. Omni Knight has been the highest win rate pub hero for months and months and months now. I think for over a full year. He is actually right now, as of this month, he is the only hero over 60% in any skill bracket in terms of win rate, and he is over 60% win rate in all 5 of these MMR skill brackets. So he is a dominant hero at every level of Dota. Yes, Sir Action Slacks, I'm looking at you how to get to 5K, but this was a change that was badly in order. I'm not really sure. I'm not an Omni Knight player myself. I'm not sure how big a nerf that this really is, but I do think it's substantial enough to make a difference in these statistics. The Dragonlance change, which was the only global change that we didn't specifically mention on the last slide, the strength bonus on Dragonlance has been reduced from 14 to 13. That is a little bit of a stealth nerf there to Drow Ranger as well as to Luna and a couple other heroes. It also addresses the recent uptick that we've been seeing in Meepo play. So Meepo, you can see his pick rate is up a little bit in 5K plus pubs, and his win rate has been up a little bit recently as well. I think maybe that's the other reason here. I know Sheepstick and a couple other Meepo players that I'm friends with are going to be sad, but that's how it works. And Underlord, a lot of people are making something of the fact that this hero was not nerfed. He obviously does need a nerf. He's kind of right behind Omni Knight in terms of being, I believe he's in the top 5 win rate across all 5 MMR brackets that we see here. Guys, it's basically a surety that he's going to get a nerf before being added to Captain's mode. Okay, so the other big announcement, the news came out late last night, we were all following along, is the Boston Major. We are going to have our first, remember, this year there are only going to be 2 majors plus TI, not 3 like last year, and we now know that the first one in December is going to be in the US. Qualifiers for this event start in only about 3 weeks here at the end of October. So again, I've said this in the past, I would have liked to see the event announced even a little bit more in advance, but I think relative to the actual tournament date, the announcement timing is fairly reasonable. The big change that a lot of people are talking about and making something of is the single elimination format of the tournament. The main event is only 4 days now instead of 5 or 6, as has been the case for the other majors and for TI. And you do have a single elimination best of 3 format throughout the tournament. So one of the trade-offs of single elimination is that you're no longer going to see best of 1 elimination games, which is something that I really disliked. You know, to me, the idea that you were having all of these teams come for a full week, play 4 or even more days of group stages before you even got to the main event venue. And then some of those teams that had been there for a full week already were going home after only one game. That was something that I really disliked. So I think that's a big benefit. And the other thing that people are going to talk about, presumably I have a hard time believing that the International would ever be held again outside of Seattle. So most people will know that the first International was actually held over in Germany, but since then, for the last 5 years, it's always been in Seattle, initially at Benaroya Hall, then moving over to the Key Arena for the last 3 years. It's hard for me to see TI ever moving out of Seattle, but again, this is a little bit of a weird thing. I don't have any inside information on this, guys. I would bet you a good amount of money that Boston may not have been the first choice in terms of a venue. My sense of this is that there were probably some other locations being explored that might have fallen through. But again, I don't know that for sure. There's no inside info going on here. This is just kind of my suspicion that's been fermenting since TI. But we are going to be back in Boston. And the other thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that the venue is going to be smaller. So the venue is going to be, I believe, a 3,500 seat arena. It's going to be much closer to the atmosphere at Benaroya Hall for TI2 and TI3 than we've seen at the Key Arena. I think this is a good thing. It's going to mean that the people are a shorter event. Fewer seats available are going to mean that the people that are there are dedicated fans. I think that the crowd atmosphere is going to be really good. But again, that's something that we'll see. In particular, there's going to be a lot that it's going to take a lot to top the atmosphere at the Manila Major. I thought that was really, really special. The last thing I'll say is about the single elimination format, because a lot of people are going to want to talk about this and make something of it. I like double elimination. All else equal, I would like to see most Dota 2 events and most events in esports in general stay as a double elimination format. That said, I actually don't mind this change in this particular instance. If you look at a 9 Valve events, so the 6 TIs and the 3 majors last season. So first of all, only 3 of the eventual champions came from the lower bracket. All right, so 6 of the teams that won the winners bracket final went on to also win the grand final. Only 3 times did somebody come out of the losers bracket final and win, that being IG at TI2, who beat Navi, EG, of course, at TI5, who won the rematch with CDC, and then OG at the Frankfurt Major, who actually started in the lower bracket, made a remarkable run throughout the tournament, eventually taking down Team Secret in the finals. I looked at this and I said, okay, the big advantage on paper of a double elimination format is you have all these teams that match up in very different ways relative to one another. Because Dota is such a strategically diverse game, it is the most strategically diverse game by far that I've ever analyzed out there. You have the potential for certain teams' playstyles to be a hard counter to others, and you don't necessarily want a very good team just to run into somebody that they match up poorly against in a winner's bracket and be out of the tournament entirely. And so I asked myself, okay, how often does it happen that we get these rematches and that the outcomes are really different in the losers bracket finals and the grand finals than they would have been otherwise? And it turns out it's actually not that often, all right? When you say 3 out of the 9 events have been won by a team coming from the lower bracket, that makes it sound like, wow, the lower bracket really matters. You know, you need to be very careful going to single elimination. If you take a little bit of a closer look, so of the 6 teams that came out of the 6 remaining losers bracket finals winners, the ones that lost in the grand finals, 3 out of those 6 were actually knocked out of the lower bracket by the eventual champion, the team that they lost to in the grand finals. One of them, eHome at TI1, was actually knocked down by the team that they ended up beating in the losers bracket finals. It's really only, if you look at the 9 Valve events and you ask the question, how many of these events would have been super, super different in terms of the top 4, top 6 teams if you'd had only single eliminations? Really, the ones that stick out to me are only OG and Liquid last year at Frankfurt and Manila. OG, obviously, that could have been quite different because they started in the lower bracket, ran all the way through. Liquid was actually knocked down into the lower bracket at Manila by MVP. So Liquid's the one team that you could say, all right, they made the grand finals. They had a shot of winning that tournament. That definitely would have been different had it been single elimination. But I think if you go back to the other Valve events, you look at this, a lot of the lower bracket finals and the grand finals that we're seeing are rematches anyway. And so I think, to me, from a fan's point of view, it takes a little bit of the drama away when you're watching a winners bracket final and you're fairly sure, or you're watching a winners bracket semi and you're fairly sure you're going to see a rematch of this series later in the tournament anyway. And that really has been the case in most of these double elimination, the way that most of these double elimination formats have played out. So I'm not necessarily arguing that we should go with single elimination from here on out. TI, for example, I feel pretty strongly should always be a double elimination event. But I do think a lot of the people that are skeptical out there ought to be willing to give single elimination a try. And the other thing I'll mention here, if you do the math, now granted this is a pretty complicated calculation. What it's doing is it's taking a fixed distribution of ELO across some number of teams going into an event, and it's simulating various tournament formats, and it's ranking how often it basically, a tournament format gets more points the more often the better teams are finishing higher in the standings. The better ELO teams coming in, are they consistently finishing higher in the standings in these various formats? And what you see, the ones that I will highlight, the two formats that are most likely to be in play here, assuming that we're going to run things like last year's major, are going to be something like GSL groups into single elimination, best of 3, but with best of 5 finals, and GSL groups into double elimination, best of 3 with best of 5 finals. And what really sticks out to me here is that in terms of the scoring, now again, this is a pretty complicated metric, and I should say emphatically, there is no one best tournament format. It depends on how you rank them. It depends on how much you care about the number of games. Obviously, if you let me have a 100 game tournament, that's always going to be, or almost always going to be, more accurate in terms of the better teams winning more often. But if you look at single elimination versus double elimination, this to me being the relevant comparison, because this is how the majors last year were run, it's really not that much of a difference in terms of the best teams winning more often. And GSL into double elimination versus single elimination is actually about 50% more games. So you're getting only a very, very modest, I mean, compare it to like a best of 3 throughout with randomized seeding. Okay, you're getting a very, very modest gain in terms of the best team winning more often at the cost of 50% more games. So I actually think this GSL into single elimination, if indeed that's what the format is, might be a bit of a sweet spot in terms of compromising number of games against the quality and accuracy with which the main event results are determined. I'm pretty optimistic in terms of how this tournament's going to go. Among other things, PGL being brought back in is really a thrill. You guys can find the photos of me on Twitter last year from Manila, reacting to some of the new features that they introduced. The innovation that they brought to the table last year at Manila, even though some of the in-game stat overlays weren't perfect when they were first introduced, they brought a heck of a lot of innovation to the table. They spurred a lot of development of great features. I'm really excited to see what they do. So that's been the first episode of the new season of Stats Don't Lie. Once again, I will see you back in another week or two to talk about some of the other issues around the Dota 2 scene. This is Nahaz, and I will talk to you guys soon.